Hello, welcome to DIY is my happy place. I'm Amy, and today we're going to be talking about how some projects turn out and some need a little extra love. I'm talking about my countertops in my bathroom, which I used an epoxy on to make it look like stone. But I have to say, I'm reminded of my theme, which is right here. Focus on the good and bury the pans. In a nutshell, it means not everything always turns out. And sometimes you have to start from scratch. And I did have to do that a couple of times. I'm going to show you my process. And I'm going to show you how I finally ended up with a product at the end that I love, and I hope you do too. So let's have some fun. About 5 years ago, I painted the linoleum in this bathroom, but I never did anything with this purple formica, much less the rest of the bathroom. It just kind of needed a makeover. So I've been transforming the entire thing. The first thing I did was paint the purple formica with a gray paint so that the underlayment would be better than purple when I put epoxy over the top. Having a good base color before you epoxy is an important part, and you can paint any color you'd like. Okay, I've done a lot of epoxy in my day, and I usually use a different brand, but I picked this one up because I just wanted to be able to get it done. Basically with epoxy, you need to do exactly two parts. It's part A and part B. And the whole point is you got to get them exact. If any one is just a little bit off, the epoxy won't set up right. So you mix these two together. You do want to mix them really well. This one's actually a colored epoxy. So I have a container. Usually you want to have a throwaway container. So I'm just using this. And you can either mix it really good with a popsicle stick, or I have a paintbrush stirrer. So I'm going to show you how I do this. You definitely want to tarp off your area. And I've taped off around the sink. I'm going to be pulling that tape, but I just don't want any of the epoxy to touch into that. And then you have to realize that it will drip off. So that's what we need. The other thing is epoxy is so sticky whenever you're working with it. So I get my gloves on. Now I'm going to use this whole thing because I actually have two projects that I'm going to be using. I wouldn't need this much for here. So I'm going to mix up the whole entire two parts in this package of epoxy, both the part A and part B. Definitely want to get everything in there. It's interesting to me. I've always just used a clear, and I added color myself. So this will be a new try for me. It is a gray epoxy. I'm noticing that this particular type of epoxy is a little thinner than what I've worked with before, but we're going to see how this works. The main thing is to measure exact equal parts. Now, if you were just doing a small counter like this one, and you only needed half of that, that's okay. You just need to make sure you measure it exactly and then seal it up really good. When you mix it, again, you could use a popsicle stick or a paint stirring stick, but you really want to get those mixed together. And so I just invested in one of the paint stirrers that you put on the end of your drill, and it has helped this so much. I have found I used to do epoxy on the top of different pictures, make tile pictures. Sometimes I wouldn't get the epoxy mixed completely, and there'd be one little spot that just always stayed tacky. So that's when I started really learning the importance of mixing this up. Now, once you get this done, you do want to hang this over something or put it on, maybe some sort of a plastic container, because if it's plastic, you can peel it off later. but you definitely don't want to put it on some sort of paper to dry. You don't want to use soap and water and try to wash it off. That's not going to work with epoxy. Okay, so here we go. I'm doing my first initial pour, and I have to say I just don't know what to expect with this gray epoxy, and so we're gonna figure this out together. Now what I like to do is get a cheap paintbrush. I actually picked mine up from the Dollar Tree, and you definitely want to rub that paintbrush off on your leg or something to make sure there's no loose bristles, because you don't want your bristles coming off when you're putting on your epoxy. Now the first thing that I always do is make sure to get a very thin layer over the entire surface of what I want epoxy to be on, because when you have a thin layer on, then when you pour the other, it'll ooze around. If there's any dry spots, it just kind of puddles around and it won't hit all those spots. So that's why I always put a good thin layer all across the entire surface, and then I can add more epoxy. Now, as you can see, this is the final thing that I did with this bathroom flip. The other parts, the mirrors, the floor, the cabinets, the decorations, all of that has been done. So this is my last and final thing, and I'm so looking forward to completely having this bathroom made over. It will be so nice. Now, on this countertop, it was some sort of a purple laminate, and I actually painted it. I did this prior. I painted with a gray latex paint, and it really doesn't matter what kind of paint you put underneath, because once you put epoxy on, it just seals it up. So you can do it any color you want. I'm still a little bit, the jury's still out whether I'm going to like this gray with my golden blue, but I will say this, with epoxy, you always want to put 2 layers on, because laminate always has a few spots that are higher and lower, and or maybe even a little dimpled area, and you can't really tell until the epoxy is completely dry where those spots are. So it's always best to do 2 layers of epoxy. So this is just the first layer. Now I use a heat gun to get all the bubbles out and to help make this flat as glass. You can use a hairdryer or a torch, but I just happen to have a heat gun, so that's what I like to use. And I wish that this could really, oops, I got that cord in the way. I wish you could really see up close. It just could not get the video to show how it is popping all these little, tiny little bubbles and just flattening everything out. And as I'm doing this, I'm realizing that I'm not especially fond of the look. I don't love this gray. It's a little bit hazy in and out. I'd rather have it, I don't know, I'm not loving it. But again, the beauty is this is just my first coat, and so it's okay. Now, once I get it all level, I want to pull the tape off from around the sink well before it starts to dry, when it's still very, very wet. Now, I did this with 2 different bathrooms, so this is an example of where there was a low spot, and it just would not hold the epoxy. So I had to wait for it to get drier, and then I added some more epoxy before it was completely dry, but when it was starting to set up, and I know that I'm going to have to go back and sand that area. It's always best if you fix these types of areas with putty or something before working with epoxy, because epoxy is not easy to sand, but I didn't even realize there was that hole there. So you can fix it with epoxy if you have to. Now, this is the thing. You never want to touch this until it has dried overnight. And for some reason, epoxy knows if you try to touch it before it's been overnight. So you definitely want to let it dry. Once it's completely dry, it looks the same. You can't tell when it's wet or dry. And that's why you don't want to touch it till you know that it is completely dry. Now, this is when you're going to want to sand it down to make sure that you get any little imperfections. If there's any tiny little bumps or anything, you can sand it. And this is, of course, my first coat. Now, I'm using a heavy grit sandpaper because I know that while I was looking at this, I'm not loving the color. So I'm actually going to put a layer of paint in between my two coats of epoxy to get a color that I'm more happy with. I actually don't mind this color in the other bathroom because the paint that I had underneath was much darker gray, and so it just looked better to me. But in this bathroom, I'm not loving it. I can see the, I don't know, it's just too clear, I guess. So I can see the layers underneath. Now here's what it looks like when it's all prepped for the second coat of paint. Now, if I was just putting another layer of epoxy, I would do another layer of sanding to really do the fine sanding, sandpaper. But since I know that I'm just painting over this, I don't need to get it to the fine grit because it just won't matter. So here's what it looks like when I get all the imperfections sanded out. And again, this is the beauty of doing two coats. Now, I took some paint. I didn't know for sure what I was going to do. I just mixed a few colors together because I didn't want it to be too matchy-matchy with the counter or the floor. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason. I just took a white and some of my navy blue paint, mixed it together. It's actually a rich navy satin that I picked up from Walmart in their grab and go section. And as you can see, my method here is real high tech. I just grabbed a little stick that I'd been using for stirring paint, and I just want a little bit more blue, but not completely covered with blue. So I'm just adding some little trains here and there. I'm not trying to have it look a marbly look. That's not the look I'm going for, although I have done this technique to marbleize it. But I just want to add, I want to have some different shades of blue in there and a little bit lighter. So the reason that I'm doing this drizzle method is just to add, so it will just touch on adding that color in. And I'm telling you, I am not a professional painter. And I've watched a lot of videos online of fancy marbleizing and stone techniques, and I'm not good at it. So I have to find a no-fail option, which is the grocery bag. So I'm just taking the bag so that I can smush it around, kind of like how we used to do in the 90s on the walls. But when it is on a counter, it will look like a fancy stone. And I am absolutely loving how it looks. This is the one beauty about paint. You can keep on going over it until you have the exact look you like. Now that I have done it this way, I'm going to go ahead and put a clear epoxy over the top rather than going with my gray. So I'll go ahead and speed this along since we've gone through this process once before, but this is my second coat, and this time I'm using the clear. The same process, I'm going to mix the whole thing up. Again, I have two bathrooms going at the same time, which I don't recommend. I should have done just half at a time and not try to do two at a time, because running up and down the stairs in order to do each process before they set up was a little bit more than I should have taken on. Don't recommend that, but luckily I have two bathrooms with the countertops done now that I've done this process. I will say that my second bathroom is going to be completely renovated, but I did it in the opposite direction. I did the countertops first, and then I'll renovate the rest of the bathroom, whereas in this bathroom, the countertops were the last thing that I did. So either way works. All right, so we're going to pour this glaze out. And you can see there's a lot of little tiny bubbles in after you've mixed up your epoxy. but when we use the heat gun, it just pops them right out. And again, you could use a hairdryer if you need to. So we're going to put the epoxy on with the paintbrush and then flatten it out. This is the next morning after it's completely dried. Now, there is one little tiny step that I forgot to mention. Once you put your epoxy on, it will drip down. You have to have something to keep it from dripping. And every half an hour or so, until it's completely set up, you need to take a popsicle stick or some sort of straight edge and rub the very bottom in order to keep the drips from building up along there. Now you could sand it off later, but epoxy is not the easiest thing to sand. Okay, here comes our reveal. My blue and gold bathroom is finally done. And look at that counter. It looks like it's wet. It's so shiny. And I actually love the high glaze. It is so great. I did everything else, and now finally the countertop is complete. When you put epoxy on, even when it's dry to the touch, you do need to give it a few days to completely cure before letting any water or putting other things on it. But it is so nice to have a stone look with an old Formica countertop that used to be purple, and now it is the color that I absolutely love. And my favorite part about this, if I ever get sick of blue and gold, I can paint everything again. And even my door, I whitewashed and just glammed up the entire room. But it's not a huge overcommitment, because if I want to change my mind, I just paint it again, put another coat of epoxy on, and I can have a completely different look for a very reasonable price. I have to say, I am just loving the outcome. Look at this. I just want to keep on going over and touching it like, wait, is that really dry? Yes, it's dry. But I will tell you, don't touch it before it's dry, because you'll be so sad that you messed up that beautiful glazed look. And when it is halfway between dry and wet and you touch it, it's going to leave a mark that will stay. You'll have to sand it out and put a new layer over the top. I'm just saying, for a friend, okay with me. I've messed it up before on previous epoxy jobs. So don't do it. Just let it dry, and then you'll be so happy you did. Isn't this great? I have to say, of all my bathroom flips that I've done, this one might be my favorite. Absolutely am thrilled with the final product. This is my other bathroom, and I had a charcoal paint underneath and then put the gray over the top, and that is a complete makeover that'll be down the road. But for now, let's stick with my blue and gold bathroom that is completely done. I'm so glad that everything worked out like I thought it would in my mind. Even though I had a few mess ups here and there, the final product is worth the wait. I accidentally splashed paint on the door, so I had to whitewash the door, and now I love the door way better than I did before. If you want to see how I did the complete makeover, I have some videos that will show how I painted the linoleum, how I made all the embellishments in the room, every single part, step by step. And my final video will be next week of how I whitewashed the door and whitewashed the cabinets. So, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and share this video out where you can. And I will see you again soon. All right, we did it. I finally made it through this complete bathroom overhaul. I have one last thing to show you, and that is how I whitewashed my door and the fronts of my cabinets. And I'll explain why I did it. Let's just say it was a little bit of an oopsie, but now I love it even more than I did before. So If you'd like to see more videos like this, click on this one right here, or click on this one right here. See you soon.